Hi, my name is Derek McNeil, and I am the academic dean here at the Seattle School. And it is my pleasure to have with me today Pam Wilhelm. And Pam is the founder of Wilhelm Consulting Group. And I think that was in 1987. And the soul of the next economy. And so Pam and I have had the pleasure, at least my pleasure, of teaching class together on leadership and living systems. And so I've invited Pam to have a conversation with us. Pam Wilhelms, plural. She just wrote on my pad S. Plural at Wilhelms. But anyway, Pam, we've had lots of conversations over the years and talked a lot about systems thinking, adaptive systems, and living systems. And some of our connection has really been thinking about systems. But I was curious to have you talk, or maybe begin our conversation talking a little bit more about what brought you to living systems. What drew you? What were the things that caught your imagination, that you feel shaped you for this work? Because I feel in some ways you've been shaped for this work. What would you, as that comes to mind, those images or thoughts or places or times or moments, what has shaped you for this work?
It's an interesting question. There's so many streams come into the shaping of this. Having grown up in natural living systems and being very tied to nature and ocean and backpacking, and I was an environmentalist in high school, and my undergraduate was environmental engineering and urban design, for the reason of preserving our natural living systems. But I was already I'd read Jane Jacobs' Life and Death of the Great American City when I was in high school, and that's what I wrote my college scholarship essays on, is how do we build cities in the future because of the sociological impact of greenery and natural systems on urban areas. So that early intersection of what the impact of natural living systems on social systems started way back in high school. And I didn't really put all that together till later in life. I did my undergraduate in kind of studying ecological systems and large-scale land design and urban design, and looking at how do we lay out cities for sociological reasons, with greenery and tie to environmental protection and environmental design. And then I did my graduate work in psychology and theology, and the systems work that was involved in psychology. I was really very drawn to family systems. So I'd left ecological systems and I was looking at social systems and human behavior and organizational behavior and family systems. And then when I got out of graduate school and went back into doing consulting in organizational development and leadership development, I found the work of Meg Wheatley and Peter Senge and others. I had read some of the folks who influenced them when I was studying ecosystems, and Christopher Alexander's work. He wrote the book Pattern Language, which it's an architecture book, but all on the design of patterns in buildings and in landscape spaces, on the energy of social systems. And so his work had really influenced me. And then they were making direct connections. Meg Wheatley and Peter Senge were making direct connections to social systems and organizations with their work. And that just came alive to me.
So it kind of plants to people, if you will.
Right.
Or at least ecologies to social ecologies.
Right.
Well, one of the things, Pam met my wife in Belize, and a conversation about theory U, which seemed to be a conversation I was buzzing at the time. And I think you recall that you were talking about theory U, and she said, "Oh, my husband is interested in that stuff." And there's not many of us, at least at that moment, seem to be interested in theory U. But very much about systems, living systems, and transformation. And so along with this idea of systems and ecology, you also have this piece about transformation, change, the upheaval of the old for the new, or at least the continuity of the old and new. And we get a chance to play in a class together, talking about the soul of the next economy. And I'd wonder, if you'd share a little bit about what's the soul of the next economy? What is that? As we talk about systems that are transforming and changing.
Yes, the soul of the next economy came out of work that I was doing in a number of areas with business that is driving a triple bottom line. So business that was driving an environmental and social bottom line. And I first started working with those businesses in 1999. And my first vision for what we're doing with the dialogues, the Soul of the Next Economy is an initiative in which we bring people together from all parts of the system for transformational change to how do we measure wealth beyond GDP and the shift to a regenerative economy. And it started with this work in business. And in 2004, it began as the Faith and Sustainability Network. Because in 2004, the Soul Sustainability Consortium was hosting its first global conference on business and sustainability and systems thinking. So the Soul Sustainability Consortium came out of the Society for Organizational Learning. Peter Senge started it, and then a couple of my friends started the Sustainability Consortium in 99, which was companies using learning organization principles from Peter's work to apply to triple bottom line thinking with businesses. And I was fascinated by that. It's the connection to my own soul of this very powerful institution on the planet that was going to drive business for good, a business for the benefit of human flourishing and for flourishing of all life on the planet. And but it was in 2004 at this conference that Ford was hosting in Dearborn, Michigan, that I realized that everybody I knew that was leading in this area, Ray Anderson was the founder and CEO of a carpet company in Atlanta who had completely transformed his company. Peter Senge, my friends who started the Sustainability Consortium, Joe Lauer and Sarah Schley, were Jewish. All of my friends were coming from a deep sacred narrative. And 2004, it wasn't a good career move to start working in sustainability. It wasn't a place you were going to make a lot of money. It wasn't a place, if you were inside Unilever or Harley Davidson or Ford, that it was a good career move to start to push the company on a social, environmental bottom line. But everybody that was doing it was doing it from a place of their own sacred narrative and their own framework of what a life well lived was. And I realized as we started to shift from looking at the word sustainability in business to regenerative, and started looking beyond business to multi-sector work for how do we measure wealth beyond GDP in a new economy. That this spiritual dimension is core to the shift. And it wasn't being talked about. We weren't talking about the fact that none of our sacred narratives measure wealth by GDP. They don't measure a life well lived by the amount of crap we create.
Which is interesting, because I think that feels like the dilemma in the same period we're in now, where there's so much transactional conversation. The deal is a transactional concept. And I don't hear enough spiritual conversation, the transformation. And the distinction between the quid pro quo and the transforming of something feel very qualitatively different. And part of your interest in the soul of the next economy, again, that's probably why we use the word transformation as opposed to transaction. We have thought of business in many ways, at least for many of us, have thought of business as being a transactional opportunity. Well, this is a bit more of a transformative opportunity. And it does require us to think and listen spiritually than just simply profit. And I think that's what some of the things that I hear in what you're saying and what seems to draw you. I've always heard that desire to, for instance, to see this conversation in the church. And for Christians to take up a conversation about people, place, and profit. But to think about how we adapt and live and engage each other in transformative ways, not just simply in transactional ways. Yeah, that's been part of our conversation in terms of talking.
Yes, and I just had that challenge this week. I was speaking, hosting a salon at Sojourner Summit on the role of just business for the shift to a just economy. And we talked about in the Christian world, in the NGO world, we won't hold businesses accountable for their social and environmental responsibility because we want their philanthropy. So we've made the trade-off, we've made the deal that we don't care how you made the first 90% if you give us the 10%. But there's no way that 10% is ever going to make up for the damage that's done or the potential redemption in what business can do throughout their value chains around the world. When they go into a village, do they leave the village environmentally and socially better if they have a factory there? If they're employing people? The redemptive quality or the destructive quality. We have to look at their role throughout the value chain. And that's such a beautiful picture of shalom if you look at business that way. And you look at it as a living system and the living system of the planet. And it's a big shift from the transactional thinking of we want their money, so we're not going to make them angry, which is what happens. We in fighting human trafficking, many organizations say we want the money they give us from their philanthropy, so we're not going to ask them if they have human trafficking in their supply chains. And that gets back to the systems thinking piece.
And I like the notion of shalom, which has more holistic a quality to it than just simply lack of conflict. The way you use shalom, it has the sense of a larger holding, a larger peace, a deeper peace, a peace amongst, not just a peace within, but include that as well. And to think beyond the initial deal. I don't have a better way of saying it. About the initial transaction, what then is for my neighbor, and how is my neighbor for me? And how do we, in some ways, worship, hold to a sense of sacredness about life, both with each other, but also with nature. And I am not at all, been raised as a tree hugger or anything like that. But as we think about the destruction we're doing, it seems all of us have to be attentive. And even if we don't decide it's humans doing it, it still behooves us to be attentive. This is, in fact, if we're responsible for having some dominion, whatever that means for some, that means really responsibility and care. And how do we care for the earth? It's been interesting. I think, again, our conversation, which I think is still called running conversation, you talk a lot about desire to see, again, this in the church, and I want to push you a little bit. And maybe ask you, what is your dream? What would be your dream? To see the church and Christian folk involved in this in some sort of way, both a living systems approach, the soul of the next economy, thinking a bit more than just simply transaction. What would your hope be? What would your dream be?
There's so many. You mean the dream of people following Jesus being involved in this?
Yes.
Well, most of my friends, I say this in Christian circles all the time, that most of my friends over the last 18 years working in for-benefit business are Jewish and Buddhist. The Christians have been coming into this only in recent years. And did you see a lot of Christians? And if there were Christians in it, they didn't come out of the closet because Christians were seen very negatively. And you were seen negatively as a social justice, environmental justice person at church if you were in the evangelical space. And you were seen negatively as a Christian in the environmental and social justice area and in the corporate world. And so my Jewish friends are very integrated with that word shalom. And they can they defined it for me. They taught me a lot about my Christology because Jesus was a Jew, and my Jewish friends have an integrated perspective of the creation that was given to us to sustain life. And their vision of shalom and being part of creating shalom is that wholeness. It's a wholeness. It's a redeemed wholeness that shalom is, and we've always thought of it as peace, as lack of conflict, but it's so much bigger than that. And so I really would have a dream that we as followers of Jesus would see that fullness of what we're called to, and I see it embedded in his teachings, embedded in the Sermon on the Mount. So many, there's environmental, social, and economic justice is inextricably linked. And to see that there's no environmental injustice that's not also a social injustice ever. Ever. It's always the marginalized communities that will get the bad water. They live downstream. They live down water. They live in the bad air. It just is to look at the holistic system of that. So the dream really would be, for Christians to start to see this picture of there's a big movement right now. This is part of the dream. There's a big movement now with aggregates measuring beyond GDP. So what are the things we should measure? As long as GDP is our measure, we have a degenerative economy where every living system is in decline. We measure wealth by the speed at which we kill things. Extract natural resources, put it through a consumerist system, and put it out as toxic waste. And the faster we do that, the more developed we are. And in some sense, none of our sacred narratives of our ancient faith and wisdom traditions, particularly Christianity and Judaism, would define a life well lived by that. They all come down to justice and a commitment to the common good. And there's this large move to look at measuring what matters. Measuring what does it mean to be human on the planet right now, and how do we share the planet with 9 billion people? And what are the things we need to measure as a society? Because what gets measured gets done. That takes us towards a holistic dream of shalom for sustaining 9 billion people on the planet. And that encompasses issues of war, and peace, and environmental justice, and so many things that require a level of consciousness that we haven't evolved to yet. I think we've evolved to a place that's gotten us into this mess.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the theory U work. I love the collective systems work, because I believe that when we come together, that evolves us to what we have to deal with right now. And we're dealing with that as a country right now. What is the evolution needed to deal with this tragedy that's in front of us?
And again, it speaks to a real need for spiritual, I'll say revival, or revitalization, that helps us to recognize the transaction is important, but not enough. And I don't want to get into demonizing transactions, but what you're describing is not enough. That it requires a spirituality that pushes towards transformation. And I think that's what we kind of have accepted that the transaction's good enough. And I think the challenge is to let that die, because you talk about a different way of thinking. This is sort of transformation of our minds, or our mental models, if you will, to recognize that transactional is not enough. It's significant, but not enough. Yeah. I want to shift a little bit. We have a few more minutes left to talk about, because you've been teaching here a couple times. What's it like teaching here to our students who come with a myriad of perspectives, and particularly teaching leadership, when many of them have issues around leadership or challenges around leadership? I can recall one student saying that their idea of leadership was always negative, or at least some who talk about ambivalence about their own leadership and others. And what's it like teaching here? And what have you learned from our students? I'll ask that question.
Oh man, there's so many things embedded in those few questions right there. So don't let me not forget any of those questions.
It was unfair to ask so many one time.
Right. So I'll start with what it's like teaching here. You know, I'm a fan of the Seattle School. I love the deeper questions that are asked in the Seattle School. My work in the world since I got out of seminary has been in the deeper questions that the Seattle School poses to their students, and these deeper systemic questions. So teaching here is a joy to bring in systems thinking to a group of people who are here because they're uncomfortable with the hierarchical mechanistic models of church that they have inherited, that they grew up in. So that is fun. It's at first when I came in, my assumption and my desire for teaching in the course was this shift for people who are pastoring in churches or in our denominations of what their role is in leading systems change away from hierarchical models to systems models. And that's the work that I do in business and government, is leaders that want to drive systems health. And it's a completely different set of leadership competencies to lead in a hierarchical mechanistic system versus leading in living systems. And that work that I first started reading in the 90s of Meg Wheatley's work and Peter Senge's work had such a deep Christology to it that it's just a great joy to come in and dive deep into the Christology of that work with students here and with you, partnering with you to do that. The interesting thing I realized the second time we did the course, and it got reinforced this last time, is that most of the people in the room were not looking to go back into the traditional church to lead systems change. They are out working with people in the margins. And so with a belief that systems change on the margins, and that most of the time my role is working with people who have power in the current system. to step out of that role and create the space for the shift of where the change is happening on the margins. And here I'm working with the people who are working on the margins, and how do they step in and help bring that work to the center and get the voice of the margins to the center of the church. Because that's our greatest need right now, because there's amazing, beautiful work happening outside of the institutions. And the larger capital C body of Christ is going to become healthy as we start to listen to the beautiful, healthy systems that are happening out on the margins. So that's one of the things I love about teaching here. Things that I've learned from the students. You just have to love a class that starts out saying that they just came into a leadership intensive and their entire definition of leadership is negative. And so it's, taking on just all of the, at the core of social systems, we talk about points to intervene in the system, and the most influential points to intervene in the system are the mental models being held in the system, and particularly the mental models we don't know we're holding. And the Seattle School is a place that explores those boldly. And so they're boldly brought into the room. And it is just refreshing, joy, nourishing to me.
Refreshing. That's a good word for it, refreshing. Right. Because we have to have those surfaced. So I have to be in places that surface them. I come from the majority power culture, Christian, white. I've had this little gender issue in my culture, but compared to the rest of the world, gender issues, it doesn't compare. So it's so I love the explorations with students here. One of the things too I have seen and watched students, or they repeat to me, is just how helpful it is again to have that shift from a linear thinking to a systemic thinking models, to thinking in cycles, if you will, or thinking in circles versus thinking in lines, and how that becomes almost transformative for some. And they may be sitting in the same situation before, but begin to see it in different ways and try to begin to understand what are the leverage points, or what are the places that they can intervene and be effective, and not just feel like they're bumping their heads against a wall. And so for all the, 3 classes we've taught every other year, all of our students, or at least many of those cohort of 3, talk a bit about that shift, that shifting, that sort of framework shift, or i.e. that mental model shift, to begin thinking about cycles and to begin to recognize and see the cycles that are happening around us all the time. And so it's not as if cycles aren't present, we just have not been looking at them. And part of the benefit of teaching with you, it's been a joy and pleasure to teach with you, is to have them see from an outsider's perspective in a way, to bring an outsider's perspective that then becomes part of an insider perspective with them, and for them to see their own environments and places where they work, or places where they're trying to do service, as places that have the capacity to shift. And some of that shifting has more to do with their seeing than them forcing something to happen. And I think that has been a gift to us, and very grateful for your work with us. As we come to close, I wonder if last thing you'd want to say to our audience or to our guests who are listening.
The gift of them seeing in systems often at first comes across as an email. Okay, I can't stop seeing systems. You've ruined me forever.
It's still a gift.
Yes. Which is true. that once you start to see systems, and the majority of people who choose the Seattle school are people that want to see systems. Mm-hmm. And that is another fun thing about teaching here, is that oftentimes there's a certain percentage of people when I go in and teach in a general population that are natural systems thinkers. Mm-hmm. And I've given them the gift of language for how they think. Mm-hmm. And that's what they always say. Mm-hmm. They say, you just help me describe how I think, or help me put some language to how my brain works. And here there's a much higher percentage of people in the room who that is true for, because I think just the nature of this place is very systemic, and the nature of what you focus on in text, soul, and culture, and the exploration of the divine and of the being followers of Jesus in this context comes from a very living systems perspective. The other thing that I would love to say is that I really appreciate teaching it with you, as for so many reasons. Your gift of seeing systems, your gift of systems thinking, and just the flexibility of working with this audience and how faculty play in the room with students. So we're going to go with where they want to go. We don't come in and here's our agenda. And it's been a joy to work with you in that context. And each group has been very different in terms of what they've challenged us to.
To be adaptive leaders.
Right. I remember group 2, we were going to take them through a whole U process. Yes. And that felt very authoritarian, that we had decided that we were going to go through a U process. Yes. And it was a fascinating conversation to explore what that looks like, to be the faculty who, in our culture, come in as the authority and say, okay, let's step out and look at let's explore that.
And they did want to explore not just simply the leadership we were trying to train them to be, but our leadership, the here and now issues of our leadership. And that was quite a challenge. It was a good challenge, I think, a learning challenge for all of us. But they wanted to know, what about right here, right now? And the choices that we have or don't have with you all. And where's the flexibility? And I think it took us walking through that to win a certain credibility about leading them. And so we had a chance, and not planned, to model something in terms of leadership in the space. And it was, again, a joy and a pleasure to be in there with you. As we kind of said, what? But nonetheless got through.
Yes.
Pam, it's been great to sit with you. I've been sitting with Pamela Wilhelms, and we've been talking about leadership and organizations and living systems. And thank you very much for being a guest on our podcast.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you.